You look at it, and it's classic. There's no debate about it. The evidence is adopted, a policy is made.
Can you give us an example in Kenya?
Yeah.
Of an example of a policy that used the first model?
Malaria control program in Kenya.
Okay.
It was an assumption that malaria is homogeneous in the whole of Kenya. Malaria transmission is homogeneous in the whole of Kenya.
Okay.
Which is not true. Malaria transmission in the coast is different from malaria transmission in the highlands.
Yes.
Malaria transmission in the high highlands. And so it was necessary to come up with a policy then. How do we put up a malaria control strategy in Kenya? It had to be different from the coast region, different from the highland region and the highland region. And evidence was there. Everybody saw it. And their policy did not take anything. It just took that classic.
Okay.
Another research you can do, you'll have to go to elective affinity model. You'll have to bargain, or you'll have to go to them, or they will talk to you and say, okay, let us commission another research to try and see if we can get more evidence.
Could you give another example of where this model?
I haven't gone through that one yet, but I think different
It occurs.
adopt different models.
For different policy makers adopt different models.
Where the global influences, influence national policy, because in some instances they will do research about HIV, male circumcision. The decisions are made at a higher level, and at the national level they're just taken up, with the adapt.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to see, because it would be rational, but it doesn't almost fit in there.
Right.
Maybe we'll discuss it later.
Yeah.
But I also know that there is a mix of approaches.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's enlightenment. For instance, like around cigarette smoking, it's gradual and the momentum builds up and it happens. Other times, for instance, around maternal health for Uganda, it's more like elective affinity model, where the politicians decide that this evidence will work for us. It will make the case, we're justified to choose this option. Then they will take up the research. While if it was against their position, they wouldn't take it up.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And have probably gone through different processes. And so that's important for you when you're considering your research, where in the process it fits, and what's the political situation in which you're existing. Political parties are always changing, priorities are changing. Funder priorities, in some ways, redirect what the priorities of a country are. And if you don't have a sense of what's happening up here, and you're just buried in your research, then you won't know. And if you don't think about what kind of model would this policymaker, my Ministry of Health, or my Minister of Finance, or my Minister of Agriculture, how he's thinking or how he gets influenced. If you don't understand the way that they work, what kind of models they might be using for their own scenarios, then you can't necessarily find a way to intervene into that, and how to place yourself as a researcher, as a research team, or as a network or collaboration. So understanding A, the models, but B, which models might be used in which situations, can help position you better. Not guaranteed, like anything in life, nothing is guaranteed, but at least puts you in a better position. Did anyone want to share a different experience of any of these models and the policies in your country? Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. I should also share something about our user fee policy. At some point we had user fees. And in the beginning, when people started paying fees, we didn't have a policy that really said people should pay fees. But it just started in different districts and so on and so on. And so it became a policy. And then during election time, the opposition candidates said, we shall remove user fees if you elect us and so on. So the president pulled the plug and said, user fees have been abolished. But after that, to support this, then we started using the evidence to say, actually, when you look at the evidence, user fees were stopping poor people from accessing the services. So it was really important for us to remove user fees. But again, we're at that point where we are saying government does not have enough money to provide services. People need to be able to contribute. And politically, it's like that is something that will take away votes. So it might not be so acceptable. And yet, in the reality, it seems like we don't really have enough cash to offer everyone free services. So it's that big, so,
Yeah. It's interesting what election time does when it comes to, but then the struggle happens when policies are passed, whether they can actually be implemented. So there's one thing in terms of policy formulation and influencing policy formulation and policy development, but then what happens at the policy implementation stage? That's another struggle. Jackson.
Policy formulation at global level. I don't think any policy at WHO level can be formulated without scientific evidence.
You're right. I think in general, the WHO is very strong on the requirement of evidence to inform policies, particularly because it's a normative organization and they're making policies for the whole world. The problem with using evidence to make decisions for the whole globe is that they're not contextualized. And that's the biggest criticism that WHO faces, is when you make these global decisions on what's a good policy, it's not always a good policy for every country. But generally they're built on evidence, but it's oftentimes selective evidence, because not every country is doing research that contributes to that decision, because it's not a priority for their country. Jackie.
Other international bodies, for example, the WTO on policies on drugs and what, which are affected, for example, in a country, Kenya, finding all types of drugs are down there because of some policies that were not well made at international level. And then I will give an example of elective affinity in a country. There is currently the central government decided to buy some equipment, and they voted and they went ahead and did it. But later when the governors were in arms and war, so they are calling them one by one come and sign. So most of them are accepted to endorse that they related to the they refuse it when they have nothing to do, but they are accepted.
Right.
Give an example of a policy that actually worked in our country here on using that linear model.
Okay.
I know you studied it and said many times it doesn't work, but does it work sometimes?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Jackson gave a great example of it. Go for it. Give us another one.
Yeah, the other one I wanted to share was the policy that was passed immediately after the results of the mother-to-child HIV/AIDS protocol study, which was done here in Uganda, and it showed that there was real evidence of reduction of mother-to-child transmission of HIV to a level of, at that time it was about 50%, 49%. And because of the sheer numbers, remember I said comparing proportions and numbers, it matters if you're really going to look at the complete picture. So the numbers, in terms of absolute numbers, that 49% represents so many children who would be saved by just taking a pill of nevirapine. So was there something better than that? No. And immediately that policy, the results of that study were released, WHO passed a policy to give all children, all pregnant women that nevirapine. So I think that was a good example of a policy that was passed straight after results of a scientific study were actually released. So what did they do? They did pass the policy and it started operating, but they went back to review that, evaluate the evidence and the quality of the study. And the final percentage that was actually truly obtained after re-evaluation and critical look at that study and how it was done went down to actually 42%, which was still good enough considering the situation that it was. So I think it also matters how dangerous the threat, the public health threat is globally, even beyond the national borders. So that was a policy that was passed at the regional level, so inevitably had to become policy by the national countries.
Work for certain policies depending on the attributes of the research results. If they're not very controversial, that's helpful. If there's no alternatives, that's helpful. There are some things that facilitate evidence affecting policy more directly than others. The interesting case about male circumcision and HIV, the evidence is very clear, but you can't go with that one straight from evidence to policy because of the impact it has on cultural and religious norms. So I think these are the things that impact the role that research can play in policy. And so we'll talk about that in a second, and I think that maybe I should have reordered my slides a little bit. But we talked about this, the importance of understanding the policy cycle. There's a lot of literature on policy influence, policy analysis, and it would take a course all on its own to be able to really understand it. But I think we all understand that unless we really understand the policy cycle in our countries and where in the policy cycle we can intervene, it's likely our research won't make a difference. And so it's important to learn, and as you teach this course, to do the readings as to what are the different models and frameworks and the stages in the policy cycle. And at what point in this cycle can researchers play a role? In the agenda setting, this often happens as political parties are determining what their platforms are going to be, what the priorities for research should be, and that's an interesting area for us as researchers to get involved in the agenda setting stage. So that if we help with the agenda setting in terms of country priorities for health, by nature, we'll be able to affect the research priorities for health. In terms of policy formulation, many of you are experts in what you do and may get invited onto technical working groups, advisory groups, and could be involved in the policy formulation stage. A lot of us on HSR research are doing policy evaluation. To what extent have user fees, like as Elizabeth said, affected and impacted access to healthcare? To what extent has policy X affected the health in a certain country? So policy evaluation is an area. And so if we know where in the policy cycle we could play a role, we can position our research accordingly. When you're doing health policy analysis, it would be uncommon if you didn't come across the policy triangle. And the policy triangle really talks about the different aspects of a policy that you need to understand if you want to see where your research fits in. And we've talked about the power of actors. So when you've got research results, if you don't do a stakeholder analysis, if you don't know who's for, who's against, what their values are, whether they'll support you, whether they'll oppose you, you may not be able to navigate the arena very well. If you don't understand your context in terms of the politics, in terms of the people, in terms of what the other priorities are that are facing your politicians, again, you might be hindered. The process we talked about, where in the policy cycle should you intervene? And then, of course, the content of your policy. And packaging that content is something that Suzanne will talk about. The other analysis that you can do to understand your context is what's called a pestle analysis. Has anyone heard of this? Is it familiar? Yeah? Some of you, maybe not all of you. It really helps you, the acronym helps you think about the different aspects that you need to consider when you're thinking about your environment. So what's happening in the political, the economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental aspects of the context in which you're going to be presenting or sharing your research results. And so the decision-making processes could be different in each of your countries, and it's important for you to position your course and your teaching on the decision-making processes that occur in your country. How are decisions or policies made in your organization, if people are looking more at organizational level, or how a policy is made in your country. And once you understand how policies are made, then you know where to influence those policies. So how do you increase the interest of the evidence on your user? How do you get policymakers to be interested in your research? So we know that what we need to do, we need to understand the policy environment, we need to do good, rigorous, hard research, we need to be able to communicate it in a way that's good for them. How do we get them to be interested in what we're doing? They have so many other priorities. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's also important that right from the outset, when you're setting out a research problem, that you share it with those policy makers and they are aware that this is a problem they believe is a problem too, and actually requires evidence to see whether they can change it. So as you go, you engage with them so that they move with you from the process of the research to its results. They are actually looking forward to those results, and then they will say. So that
that's a really good point.
Approach them for the first time when you have this really beautiful study and its results.
Yeah. That's a really good point. How many of you have engaged your end user in developing your research? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why have the rest of you know the importance of involving your end user and face some barriers? Are there any barriers you're facing in terms of ensuring that your policymaker or your decision maker is aware of your research before you even started? What's driving your research? Is your end user your funder? It is for some people. For some people. So for those of you that have not engaged with your decision maker or your end user, whether it's the community, whether it's the service facilities in which you're doing your research, for those of you that have not involved them in the research, can you share why this might be the case?
What I can say, me, I try to engage them. But what we have as a reaction, one, even you send them something, or that you want to read this type of problem, they don't answer to it. So you can come 10 times to give them. I'll need something from you.
Yeah.
And then if you are not, you are tired, give up.
So does that mean that if they weren't able to provide the time or the effort or the interest at the beginning of the research, do you think that impacts their utilization of the research results when they're actually complete?
It's possible if you have the case but sometimes you have to go to the elective model to push them every time to communicate, to interact, to make them understand that the evidence you have is important for the problem to address.
Yeah. What about the rest of you that aren't engaged with your end users?
I think, and most of the research I think are northern driven.
Are northern driven?
Yes.
But this is research that you're doing,
Yes.
okay? But the priorities you're saying are coming from the north.
Yeah.
Okay. The fund, okay.
And then sometimes you are just a collaborator. Obviously, already then there's a fine and all that, and you can know, then we'll come and do research here. But also, in the policies.
Other barriers or other challenges for not involving end users? Kellen.
Of the health, for example, we want to conduct the research in the health facility.
Can't hear you. Speak up.
If you want, I speak from experience, if you want to conduct research in the health facility, how to prepare money, it's not with cash. So that you can conduct research that is going to be usually so you want to why are you charging you are doing the research.
But only if they know that they will benefit from the results of the research.
It's good that the whole proposal is explained
Suzanne, you had a reaction to that?
No.
And another comment.
I agree totally. Excellent analysis. So usually the researchers will incorporate academics into this, and they're actually evaluated as good researchers if their research is of academic merit. So we are used to calling more researchers to give us this input, and we are not used to what happens after the research is done.
Absolutely. So I think that you made a really important point, is there are no incentives. We are rewarded on the rigor of our research and the publications that we make. And we're building our careers on the backs of people that don't benefit from the research that we've used from their own communities. So I think there's something about questioning ourselves and our moral obligations as researchers for why we do health systems research if the research we're doing is not going to benefit the health system. And if it's not going to benefit the health system, how do we engage with other parties, and that can help to unburden us of that engagement with the health system if we need to dedicate and protect our time for the research aspect, but still want that research somehow to impact the health system? Are there ways around it without compromising the time and rigor and requisite knowledge that we need for our academic practices? It's a difficult balance, but it's an important question to ask. Lawrence.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question you're asking whether we have any more information. I think we don't determine the ND. We put it there, but we don't, it's not, unless academicians add on the role of determining the end users. Because the end users, the framework in place, and the framework in place is determined by the policy put in place. So, unless we also academicians add on the role of being becoming politician or being more active, going beyond the being researchers and the academicians. So I don't think really the moral issue should come in unless we change the boundaries.
Any reactions to that? Eric?
Yes, I will repeat something. I made the assessment for guidance, and I need to know how nurses are involved in decision making, something like this. So when I tried to ask her to interview her, the lady, she told me no. So what I've done in the local level as research, the police will be made in top level. So it's very difficult to manage all this multi-level problem in the process. So even I have evidence in the level, but the policy is top.
Did you involve anyone from the top level?
Yes.
Okay.
But for them, for the nurse and the community health worker.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult balance, and every community is different, and they've all had different experiences. I know if you read from history, and we talked about ethics the other day, for those that went through like the Tuskegee trials or like the HeLa cells for the lady that blames Johns Hopkins and Baltimore for using her cells to be able to find discoveries for cancer, and her family received no compensation for it. For communities that have had really bad experiences with researchers, they're quite hesitant to engage with researchers because they're not sure what they have to gain from it. And there's those that just don't understand anyway how spending an hour with you in some way is going to improve their lives, because it's hard to see down the line the impact that research can have on public health. And so in terms of increasing the interest of evidence on the user, these are the kind of things that make a difference. And some of you have already started to incorporate some of these strategies in the way that you approach your research. And so I think policymakers will be interested if your research is relevant to their priorities, international priorities. It has a higher chance of impact, like we said, if it resonates with their interests, their values, and not to say that you don't do research that might oppose in values, because we know that politicians change all the time, but as long as you know you might get resistance or you might get opposition, you can prepare for it. The inclusion of policymakers or your end users at various points in the research is actually very important if you want them to use your research. Because if you get buy-in and if you get some sense of ownership from policymakers, they're more likely to listen to your research results versus that of somebody else because they feel they've been a part of it. It's an important strategy. We talked about the first model, you know, the direct model of going from research to policy, and how oftentimes we think that's quite naive and wouldn't happen. But Joanne Jackson gave us really good examples of instances in when that's happened. And generally, results or studies that have low uncertainty, low risk, and have come at just the right time often have a higher impact. They have to be comprehensible. People have to understand the results. They can't be very abstract. And this is something that we'll talk about this later this afternoon or this morning, is really how do you make sure that you package your results in different ways for different audiences. In my dissertation study in Kenya, actually, I found that the links between researchers and policymakers, the networks that you've created over the years of your expertise, can be leveraged very strategically in making sure that not you understand when in the process you should present your results, but who can be your champions. And so these networks and links can be a very important part of your strategy for influencing policy.
You are by involving policymakers in your research process. I was just trying to wonder, when do you start involving them in your research process? Is it at the technical proposal writing? Is it at the start of the implementation? I mean, at what point? Because I'm looking at a situation where you've written your proposal, submitted it in a bit, or where you put in all this science of how you're going to, design it, what like fundamental, this, and then the policy makers seem not, many of them may not be understanding that.
Right.
Somehow they might have to influence the design that you're proposing. Or you now want the grant and you are ready to implement. And you tell them, this is what we actually propose, and we're just putting it on the ground.
Right.
They're like, you can't do this kind of thing.
Right.
So at what point do you really involve them?
It's a good question. I have an opinion on it, but I'm wondering if anyone else wants to respond first. From your experiences, those of you that have engaged with policymakers, decision makers, from your experience, what worked in terms of when in this process to involve them? Prof. Simba, you were one of those people. And you've been quiet.
I hear the positive side of it.
I think it's important to hear both sides.
Yeah, positive first.
Positive first. Who's had positive experiences? Jackson.
In the African region, Global Fund, WHO, CDC, and all this money goes to ministries of health or where the money is required. Ministry of Health, for example, they are program officers in the Ministry of Health. And they have monies and budgets they have put for various activities. What we realize in Kenya that they have a lot of money for monitoring and evaluation, and research is part of that. And sometimes that money goes unspent because they don't have the capacity to do the research, etc. And so if you approach those program officers at that level and tell them this is what you have, and this is the problem, say in maternal and child health department, and this is something that we can work with you to try and find a solution. And so you leverage that money with their acceptance. You're trying to answer a question that will help their program move forward. And that way, when you come up with your research findings, they are normally very well accepted in the cooperative union policy.
Okay. Other examples? Who else had put up their hand?
Of the year when they're presenting what their needs are and the annual operational plans that they develop. And, at that point you have an opportunity to actually sell an idea that you have. And that has happened quite a number of times, especially with areas that have had issues for where pediatric HIV was one of the areas that we really leveraged on that forum to then get buy-in. And from that you get a committee form to follow up on what you're doing and give feedback to the main audience after, at various milestones. The other bit is, when you look at global fund, it has its funding, cycles. And so when you understand the funding cycles, then you're able to know at what point to strategically, give your proposal. You may actually even get funding if you're right on time. Because sometimes it's about also us, understanding the environment and also knowing when to go in and get the support. And from that, you can actually build a program or something that lasts you for quite a while. Like I said, for HIV, it really worked when I was running a program for pediatric HIV.
Of hospital-acquired infections here in our hospital in Morocco. So we went, discussed with administration, wrote a proposal, but they already knew that this was a problem. Did implementation, but with their help, came up with the results. They are published, but even at this level of writing like a policy brief, we feel that it is part of their work. So I just want to respond to what Crispus asked. Personally, I feel it is important to involve the end users right from the start.
Crispus, we are having one project that's maybe trying to learn about the integration of community as well as the informal system. Now, when this project was starting, when the research project was starting, we had all these ideas in ourselves. So we had concept papers, and then we shared this with the policy matter within the ministry. And then they came out with other notes. If this is not our priority, please, if we can do something else, that will be helpful. But if this one, we have so many commercial cases, so please, maybe you do what you do. And then we went back to the drawing board and tried to think how we could approach what they think is important. So we start again redesigning the research.
Because of the contribution that they made. Okay.
And then after that, now when it came to the technical part, because we have to make sure they understand how we're going to approach the issues.
Yeah.
And when we had a consensus, and then there was also, of course, there was like management meeting, so they also met an advisory committee, and we became part of the advisory committee. And then when we went to the field, they also came. The policymaker, okay, not necessarily should come, but they can send somebody to be part of the field.
Yeah.
So they are observing what is being done. And then we came back with the data, and then we started analyzing, and then we shared the data.
Okay. So you involve them in multiple aspects throughout.
And after that, there was like a dissemination again. Part of this.
And did you find that using that strategy was helpful in terms of their adoption or at least their acceptance?
Yes, because there was this mapping for things like that.
Do you think if you had not involved them that you would have had a different outcome?
Yes, imagine when we went to the first place, and then they said, no, we don't need that.
That would have happened at the end instead. Yeah. Because I think it's important to understand what could happen, and I think we're seeing it could be very positive, but be prepared for maybe something different. Prof, can you share with us?
Yeah, several. When the nasty one, I normally put it as a joke. First time I joined the Ministry of Health, we were sitting and trying to design the information system.
Right.
And then I said, why don't we invite, I mentioned my professor who was supervising me in masters. Why don't we invite him? I think we are going to really benefit. And the response that came was that, stop those academicians, they are going to delay us. So that was the end of involvement of academician and research.
It didn't even start.
Yes. Then I changed the position. I went back to the university. And I was surprised. A very senior person in the academics didn't know even the name of the chief medical officer.
Oh, wow.
So that is the kind of relationship that we have, under which we need now to see how we can break those bottlenecks. So what is happening currently, in terms of experience in trying to put evidence in whatever decisions are being made, is like at personal level. That someone knows me at the Ministry of Health, and there is an evaluation or a certain evaluation that is supposed to be done, and they would call you with the terms of reference written, and these are some sort of 2 weeks merry-go-round in the district, 2 districts, best performing, poor performing, and then you come and write. And these are kind of data that you cannot even publish. So that's the negative part of it.
Yeah. But you mentioned a very important part is we don't know what's happening. We don't know, like you said, who this chief medical officer is. We don't know what's happening in health policy. We don't know the policy process. We don't understand their world. They don't understand our world. And so we've got this constant, how do you bridge the gap? How do you bridge the gap? And unfortunately, sometimes it makes people more entrenched in their silos. But I know in some countries more and more we've got academics that are in political roles or policy roles, policymakers that join academia after, and it's helping to bridge the gap. And what we need to do is leverage those people around us to help us navigate better so that we don't show up in ministries of health talking about p-values. We don't show up not knowing the name of our chief medical officer. We don't show up when a policy has already been determined to say, oh, this will influence your policy, this is great. They're like, why didn't you come to me 2 weeks ago? So we need to be just as informed about their world and their realities as we hope they would about ours, and understanding that we can't produce research in 2 minutes. Research takes a long process. There are different aspects in which we can engage them in somewhere in order to preserve the rigor and credibility. Research results can't always be provided in the time that they need it. And these are always the struggles between the two parties. So then how do you increase the impact of the evidence on the user? You need to know your user. You really need to do a good stakeholder analysis on who your audience is. Your message needs to be simple and impactful. You've got all your research results, but you need to know how to share them with this particular audience. If the audience is the media, how do you engage with the media? If the audience is a policymaker, if the audience is your community, you need a different strategy for communication for each of them. How do you communicate with them? Are they going to read your publication? I don't think so. But how do you turn that publication into something they will read? How do you produce either a policy brief or a media story? Or, Elizabeth has some examples from the Manifest study here on radio podcasts. How do you get messages out, in clips on the radio? In Kenya, when I was there, a lot of policymakers said, nobody knows how to write a cabinet memoranda. We don't want to read all these big research results. We want to know how they're relevant to our decision making, and people don't know how to write cabinet memos. There's the argument from researchers, should we know how to write all this? Is this our role? Is this our job? It's a different conversation. But if you want it to be looked at, if you want it to be considered, then you need to be willing to open up the breadth of your skills to be able to meet the needs of your audience. The messenger is also an important aspect. Should it be you? A lot of people feel they have this drive to be the advocates of their results because they're the ones that know the results best. They're the ones that understand the results. If there's questions about it, they're the ones that be able to take on those questions. And I don't know, Kellen and Fesahai, if you have experiences in these areas as well, but using an intermediary, sometimes you feel like, I don't have the skills, or I don't have the relationships, somebody else does. I think if this person goes to the ministry, they'll have a better reception than I will. How do you leverage that? Why don't you leverage that, In developing countries, we know the power that funders have. We know the power of donors. So do you go through CDC? Do you go through WHO and your contacts are there to say, you presented this to the ministry. They'll listen to you. You have the credibility. How do you leverage intermediaries and other people to get your message across? If you've been able to communicate the impact of a study on your community, we've seen movements of entire civil society go with protests and billboards to the ministry to say, we need this change, we need this change. So it doesn't always have to be you, but see how you can get your message across through different messengers. And we've talked about this extensively, is when do you get the message across? So the timing is really important. And there are many frameworks for knowledge translation or research to action, and this will be part of the resources that you have in your guide for you, for your students, to learn a little bit more about these frameworks. And so I provide them here just as a reference, but you'll probably have to do some more reading on them to understand the different models. And so strategies for increasing knowledge translation and research uptake. So we talked about some of these strategies that researchers can use. So invest in understanding the policy process. We've talked about that a lot, and I hope you really understand why this is important. And ensure, of course, the credibility and legitimacy of your research. And that's just the basic, right? That's what we all do, is rigorous research. And make sure that you don't compromise on that. Engage policymakers at multiple research stages. Mobilize the unmobilized. There are people that either don't know what you're working on, they don't understand the importance of what you're working on, they don't know how to help you. So mobilize them. Find common ground. Often it helps to work in tandem with people that have the same beliefs as you. And that's you as a researcher. What about your institutions, your schools of public health, the think tanks you work with, other research institutes? What should they be doing? So it's important for your schools in general to establish linkages with the government and with policymakers. Policymakers come and go, but those linkages can stay. Your deans come and go, deans change and stuff, but the institutional links should remain. And there are ways that those institutional links can be made in terms of inviting or creating a space on your academic advisory body for a policymaker. They've learned in theory how to do an epidemiological study, but when we have an outbreak, we go to CDC. Why do they go to CDC? Why don't we create important, competent professionals in our programs to meet the needs of our policymakers? If we include them in our curriculum development, include them in academia, they might be able to help us shape what the gaps are that we're finding. Enhance collaboration with other institutions. Someone was asking earlier, if you as a lone researcher can't go and influence policy, how else do you do it? Well, sometimes a critical mass of other researchers. I know research is a competitive field, but we need to move more into collaborations. There are other institutions that are doing similar research. And if you band together and go with a simple, clear message together and join your funding, there might be opportunities to have a greater impact. And then schools need to think about changing the incentives for researchers and academics. We talked about this earlier. The incentives are to do good research, publish your research in international journals, and that's where your promotion comes into place. But what about all the time you're spending engaging with policymakers, all the impact you've had on influencing a policy? There need to be incentives for encouraging that, for rewarding that. And so, it's a matter of schools of public health and schools of medicine and nursing thinking about how do you reward this kind of engagement so that researchers feel like, no, we can create the time in our agendas to engage with the policymakers, and we will be supported to do it. And finally, policymakers. There is this concern that there's a lack of capacity on the policymaker side to understand research. And the great thing about this TOT is possibly a lot of your students will be policymakers. This is your opportunity to ensure that they see the value of research, that they know how to interrogate research, and they know why they need to use research and evidence as they're considering their policies. And you have a great role to play in that. Encourage them to create incentives to draw upon evidence in policy and network. These networks with policy communities are important. And they in turn should be establishing links with research agencies. The biggest challenge, as you've all mentioned, is funding. And I don't know how we'll overcome this because most of it comes from external donors. But if you've got students that are policymakers, and if these policymakers understand the value of research, hopefully when they go back to their own ministries, they will be able to advocate for funding for research. So once again, you have a really important role to play as trainers in the field of health systems research, particularly if your students are going to be policymakers. And then development partners. This is nothing that we can really do anything about, but it's important to know the role that they play in this big circle of life and circle of research. In terms of mechanisms for employing evidence, and I know a lot of donors, Crispus was asking at what point do you involve research users in your research? There's many donors now that refuse to fund proposals that don't include the research user. So more and more there are funders that are making this a requirement of their proposals and a requirement of their funding. And so they seem to understand the importance of that. And so as we start wrapping up, why would we want to assess the use of evidence? This itself has become an area of research. In terms of health systems research, is the use of evidence in decision making. A lot of health systems users, health systems researchers do policy analysis as part of their research. They do knowledge translation analysis as part of their research. And so these might be areas that you want to consider as health systems researchers as well. And so why would you assess the use of evidence? Well, if we know that evidence is being used in policies, then we can advocate for more research and more resources for research. But it also allows for policymakers to be accountable for their policies. Is to say, well, this was based on evidence. And if they want to base or inform their policies on evidence, it encourages us to produce the evidence. And so that's why it's important in some ways to do evaluations of evidence use. Data collection. This goes to some of what we've been talking about the last 2 days. If you want to assess the use of evidence as part of your study, that you're doing an evaluation of evidence use, what kind of data would you collect? What kind of data would be useful and how would you collect it? So obviously documents from a policy, policies that are created, you want to look at the minutes of the policy meetings, the minutes of the technical working groups, the reports, the discussions, and try and tease apart, where did they talk about research? What research did they look at? What did they discuss about the research? What research did they throw out? Why did they throw it out? So those are the kind of document analysis you can do. You can do interviews with some of the people that were part of the decision making as to, what role does evidence play in your decision making? In this particular policy, what role did evidence play? Why did it play a role? Why did it not play a role? So those are the kind of things you can do in terms of data collection when you're evaluating research use. And then the traditional forms of data analysis for those kind of data collection methods. You can create a timeline in terms of when evidence came into play, what part of the discussions, who brought it in, why, and that helps you map the actors to a certain extent as well. And if you go to this link here, which I've provided on the slides, there are many protocols that WHO has provided in terms of the assessment forms. So if you really wanted to do an assessment of evidence use or you wanted to do a policy analysis, there's a lot of protocols on this document that you can adapt into your context. You don't have to create instruments from scratch. And so there is a global movement. There's a real recognition now of evidence-informed policy making. There are institutes and networks that have been created particularly to focus on this aspect, to support evidence-informed policy making, and to encourage funding and use of evidence in policy making, and they're all listed here. A lot of donors, as I mentioned, are recognizing this and emphasizing the importance of evidence-informed decision making, and they're putting pressure on researchers, but they're also putting pressure on policymakers. And so in some ways, they're helping to bridge this gap for us. And now we even have dedicated conferences. The Symposium on Health Systems Research, there have been 3 so far, and the first one was the one in Switzerland a few years ago, and it was the first symposium ever that put knowledge translation and research uptake front and center on its agenda. And then the Institute for Development Studies in the UK and AFIDEP in Kenya created a new symposium that they launched this year in February called Reza Meetup, that brought all disciplines, not just health, but agriculture, ICT, health, education, people from all different disciplines to talk about how do you do research uptake, to try and learn from others. This is not only something we're struggling with in health, and so that was really important and interesting. When you're teaching this course, here are some of the resources that might be helpful, and you can go through this at your own time, including good curriculum design, policy analysis. There are some case studies. You can use those case studies or adapt them into your own context. Use them for examining your students if they're helpful. Examples of good policy brief. The SHORE project of the European Union has got multiples that it's worked on. There are some videos on knowledge translation, evidence to policy that you can use and interspersed in your course. Today we didn't have time to go through these, and it's been very much me talking at you. But you can intersperse videos in the way that you're teaching. The protocols, like I mentioned, are on that link. Cartoons like I use, media articles like the BBC one that I use, can all make your classrooms a lot more interactive. And there's other reference material. There are several toolkits. I was involved in writing the KT toolkit that was published by IDRC, but there are other toolkits out there. Web links for some of these networks, articles on health research and policy making and evidence use in policy making, and some video examples for shared informed decision making And the one at the bottom is quite funny because it uses The Simpsons throughout the entire presentation by this one professor. And so it makes for those of you that are familiar with The Simpsons, it makes for a very entertaining presentation. And that's it on this particular subject. Any questions, clarification?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the issue of funding for health systems research. There is this common understanding that there is little fund or no funding for health systems research. And at one time when we sat, we realized that there are a number of opportunities for funding for health systems research. Apparently, researchers do not utilize them. In Tanzania, we have the WHO has funds for researchers, small-scale researchers. We have CEDA that provides funding at the university for small-time research. We have the COSTECH that controls research throughout the country. They also have funding. And these are flexible kind of funding that are not very much fixed on a certain topic, with which annually they complain that they don't get researchers applying for funds. So I would try to imagine even in DRC, Kenya, this kind of funding might be there, but only that
we're not tapping into it.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's a good point. We do complain about funding, but maybe there is some out there that we need to be strategic about tapping into. I wonder, I know that 2 years ago when we met as Africa Hub, we had made a deliberate effort to ask all focal persons to identify funding opportunities in their countries and to create a database of these. I don't know to what extent those got populated or supported, but it was to do exactly this, is to get some probing into areas that we're not familiar with in each of these countries, to see what opportunities for funding are. And I think you bring an important point, because this project is ending soon as well. And it's a capacity building project in health systems research. And I think it might be worth resurrecting that initiative to identify what next, what happens to Africa Hub next, and who are the potential funding sources not only for health systems research, but capacity building in health systems research that can allow this group to continue to work together, at least in collaboration some way. And I don't know how often that systematic identification of funding occurs, because it must change at all times. Funding streams come and go. But I think, Prof, you bring an important point that there's likely funding out there that we're not tapping into. Any other comments? Okay.
Another is that in one of the meetings people were discussing, and the point came out that most of these policymakers, especially at national level, they are people who we schooled together. So in as much as we think we can translate, they also can translate. So maybe we need to know exactly why they are not utilizing. I can give an example where a colleague of mine was at the Ministry of Health while I was at the university. I mean, you go to him to discuss issues about whatever evidence or etc. I mean, you just can see that he can't. He doesn't have the time.
Right.
He has a pile of files that are routine work for which he has to accomplish. Somebody up there is waiting for those files.
But it's important that you appreciate that and you know that, so that you can react and act accordingly. And I think that's the point we made earlier, is if you don't know your audience.
That is one side.
Yeah.
The researcher. Now the policymaker.
There's myths on the other side also.
Much as he may know that he really needs to go and read articles and get evidence, he doesn't have the motivation to do that, given the priority that is given on those files, that he is rewarded or punished if he doesn't finish by his boss.
Right.
So you find most of the students we teach, when they go back to the ministry or to the district, they no longer go on reading.
Right. But I would argue that perhaps it's not their job to be a researcher because they're a policymaker, but at least with the training they've had, they can appreciate research better than if they hadn't had that training. And they can interrogate the research, and they can ask the right questions versus being completely ignorant of what they need to ask. Like if they had that scenario of the doubling of risk for thrombosis, someone that had been trained in research would at least ask, can you tell me what's the risk factor? What's it gone from what to what? Versus someone in the general public that wouldn't even think to ask that question. So we would hope that just like, and I think there's a myth that goes both ways. I think policymakers assume academics are just ivory tower theorists, and they don't have practical experience, they don't know what's happening in the real world, and they don't understand the policy arena. And maybe it's true for some academicians, but it's not true for all. And I think just like they need to know each individual that they work with, we need to take the responsibility about us that today I'm speaking with this program officer at the Ministry of Health. Let me learn a little bit about him so I position myself accordingly. Tomorrow I'm meeting with this person, but he does have a PhD, so I can make some assumptions and position myself accordingly. And so I think it's an important point that Prof brings up, is there are myths and there are assumptions we go in with. But I think it all comes back to really knowing your audience. Crispus?
I think the assumption, as you said, that we make that policymakers don't have enough capacity may not exactly be the right, and that sort of misleads us into the focus that we should be making. I mean, my thinking is that it is not about the number of heads that you put together in a room like this from the ministry that probably might have to change. We should begin to think about focusing on the system under which they work, because actually it's the systems. We have had professors even in universities, and the professors appointed the vice chancellor, a very vibrant researcher who's really up there, and he's made a principal of ecology. And the man is just now sitting in meetings, sitting in work, you can no longer see him in research. So we've had even here in Uganda, I've seen many of the doctors and PhDs actually crossing from the college and being appointed at the ministry. And they have but the system under which they find themselves doesn't allow them to continue to engage. Yours to do administrative work, clear files, and do this kind of thing. Maybe we might think about how can we engage our ministries. I know in Parliament that every member of Parliament has a research, they call it research assistant. They have an office, and that office has research assistants who do the research work for them, and then present some synthesized stuff, and then they can go to Parliament and make an argument. Is it possible to begin to think about such kind of engagements with the minister and say, look, if you have a director of planning, maybe they need to have people around them that can help them to put stuff together, rather than us focusing on the director himself.
You need to look at your opportunities along the spectrum. Sometimes it's even better to work from the street level bureaucrats. And you drive the movement up so that the people who make decisions take note. Other times you look at your opportunities. For instance, I know that the social services, all the committees in Parliament have researchers. I am a friend to one of those researchers who is actually an aesthetician. And they get their data from the internet. They Google, and they just throw together something. So the opportunities for researchers here are link up with these people and let them know that you have the facts when they need them. And you can actually influence how they package things, and you can teach them how to bring together a body of evidence which is more valuable than opinions picked from Twitter and Facebook and other things. So I think the opportunities are ours to look for, based on our motivation to influence incentives, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe we'll close on that very positive note. Yeah?
sorry we didn't give you enough time. You probably should have reserved the whole half day. But again, the context under which we work, understanding the context and the framework matters. So, but thank you for ably taking us through this. And I think members have found it to be very fascinating. I'm not sure about the meaning of that word. I'm just trying to put it there. So, yeah, thanks. We are going in for a short break.
Change players, you have to change strategies, you have to restart the program. So I'm glad you have the patience to engage in knowledge translation. Nazreen has just covered a lot of concepts around knowledge translation. But what I've appreciated over time is, as a researcher, I've stopped thinking that I have monopoly on evidence. Other people have evidence, and in order to promote this engagement, really? You guys are having
No, this part is distracting.
You have to know that there are a lot of players. Whenever you're trying to influence any
Students.
Yes, there are a lot of players. So my session is actually looking at, now you have your research, and you are all academics, you know how to write the scientific papers. Is there anyone who hasn't had experiences writing a publication? None. So I'm not focusing on the publication. Today we are moving away from the publication to how you communicate. But I'm actually just going to browse through quick. You don't have to understand each slide, but you're going to get all of them, and you'll have a chance to look at them more closely. So I'm approaching this as a trainer, training other trainers, so that they have to go back and they look at it and prepare a package they would give their learners, given the foundation they have been given, and adopt it accordingly. So the purpose of the unit is to enable learners to acquire knowledge, skills, and positive attitude towards HSR evidence communication. By the end of the unit, you should be able to, describe the principles of communication, identify and map stakeholders, explain the process of HR evidence communication, which kind of overlaps with what Nazreen was talking about, package the evidence, have a communication plan, which is somehow the same as the strategy, but also to design it for different audiences. So Unit 1 will capture things around communication, basically. Types of communication, communication skills, stuff like that. Unit 2, we are going to look at stakeholders, mapping them, understanding what is relevant for which stakeholder. Unit 3, the process, part of it has been covered by Nazreen, but we have understanding the how, the who, and the when of communicating, very strategically communicating. Unit 4 will look at the tools, various tools and channels used to communicate evidence. I'm not liking the way this thing is behaving. You can see it's moving. It doesn't see, the screen is not fixed.
Maybe get another one.
The screen. So like I say, communicative research includes scientific writing, but you all know that. But we want to look at the different aspects of scientific writing, of writing or communicating for policy. We want to look at the policy briefs, engaging media, other approaches which Nazreen outlined towards the end of her session. And also evaluating your communication engagement efforts as the last unit. So we will have, this is intended to have lectures, group discussions. Like I said, I am not giving you a lecture about this particular thing, but giving you a kind of foundation of building on when you go to deliver this particular content. Like I said, this was structured across the different units, what it's going to cover, or sub-units within the unit. And one of the first sub-units is Introduction to Principles of Communication, just communication. I know that researchers communicate as researchers. And they have conferences where they go to talk to each other, they share each other's findings, and they pat each other on the back, and they come back and think they have disseminated a lot of evidence. Yet, actually, they have disseminated evidence among their own people. Sometimes they call it preaching to the choir. So researchers usually communicate to the choir, and they only know how to communicate to the choir, to other researchers. So the purpose of this is to get you outside the mindset of the researcher, I'm coming, sorry, and to get you thinking about other approaches to communication. So when you're delivering this unit, I'm not going to go into it, I'm just covering what it has. So it has something to do with communication, the rationale, different types of communication channels and how to pick. It also has principles of effective communication and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. For instance, like Christopher said, you have your computer and they give you 5 minutes. You open, you look for the slides, and by the time you're ready to present, they are moving on to another item. What would work better in that case is something brief which you can read. So you need to be prepared. So this session goes through what communication is, the definition, the essence. It's a process. Some people think communication is an outcome. I communicated, I disseminated. That is very one way. You need to think about it as an interactive process, okay? And you communicate to influence behavior, influence others. So it's not simply just dishing out information. There are different ways of communicating: images, written word, body language, spoken word. I'm not going so much into that. There is downwards communication, the kind of communication researchers use for policymakers. That one, where the researchers tell the policymakers, here are the facts, go ahead, use them. Aren't you going to say thank you? Then there is the upward communication, which allows feedback and that kind of thing. So you should be careful how you're working. There is horizontal or lateral. And you get a copy of the slides, you look at them, you adapt them accordingly for the people you will train. There are networks, formal and informal, which are all opportunities for information to move. Then there is understanding around communication, understanding around the process of communication, being equal to the transfer of information between the sender and the receiver. But the result is the influence on the communication. There is the bucket theory. If anyone knows what the bucket theory is? Okay, the bucket theory of communication is when you approach such an audience and you assume that they are empty buckets. And you are going to fill them. Okay? Now that rarely works. Because you will never come across an audience which is empty. So as a communicator, forget about this theory. Okay? When you approach any situation, just know that you are not working with an empty bucket. Just know that you're actually working with a bucket which is full, but you're hoping to displace some of the content and maybe add sound. Okay? So communication needs to, there's an assumption that communication moves in one direction from the source to the receiver. There's also an assumption that it's information flowing both ways. okay? And we are going to look at that. Now, within these presentations, I incorporated exercises which, when you train in a class, you can give them. For instance, you can brainstorm on the ways you communicate. How you communicate, okay? And then see what are the most common for you and why, okay? When it comes to you as a researcher, how do you mostly communicate your work? I have seen for most people it's PowerPoint presentations, publications, etc. And usually we choose those because they are favorable to our comfort zone. We don't want to come out of our comfort zone. We just want to stay in there. So you do some kind of exercise with your learners to see what types of, what communication channels they favor and why. The reason for that is that it actually wakes you up to the fact that maybe you're not exploiting all the opportunities you have to take advantage of what lies out there. The social media, for instance, is very lucrative for sending out messages, but it's rarely used. So communication, there are lots of approaches, tools to communication. Some of them are written, some of them are oral, some of them are audio, visual, very many, social media, a number of them. What is important to know is that communication is a critical resource that must be managed, just like you manage budgets, okay? So if you're going to leave your communication, your research communication will be, whom it may concern, then you have a challenge. Now, I wanted to go through communication challenges. You probably heard of selective attention. People have attention in brief pockets of time. I might be able to get your attention right now, and I lose it in the next 10 seconds because someone has coughed in the corner and they want to find out who it was. So there is selective attention. There is selective perception. So you need to keep messages free of jargon. Because when you're communicating to a policymaker and you incorporate all these science, heavy terms which are comfortable within the scientific world, the policymaker will just pick out what they understand, and it might not be what you're communicating. So take note of selective perception, and there is selective retention. Why is this important? When you go to a policymaker with 12 messages, as opposed to 3 key messages, it's your research, you don't want to leave any interesting finding out. But you need to prioritize your messages. The moment you bombard a policymaker with so much, they will pick out, what they retain. And, studies have shown that people will remember the first name on the list and maybe the last one and some interesting one randomly. So even with the messages, they will remember what they had when they had when you had their attention. Okay? So you should also keep note of selective retention. I'm trying to run through this, please bear with me. It's just an overview, you're going to get all this material. Then there is factors affecting the message, the source, the channel, the message, and the receiver, okay? Communication is a process. Then I have content on communication channels, what you use, okay? The means through which the communication or the message is communicated to an audience, the vehicle you use to take your communication forward. And, there are various types. You have interpersonal, you might have community-based, you have media, but also you have the written, you have the oral, you have the audio, visual, you have the social media, okay? So this covers a bit on interpersonal some of their advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, there's an exercise here in controlling messages, and some of you probably already know. You know the telephone game, where I can tell him, and then he whispers it to another person, she whispers it, and by the time it gets to there, it's a different message. So these are some of the challenges of, interpersonal. Your message can be lost somewhere there. And the other person will get a message, but it might not be a message. So those are some of the challenges. So there's those exercises. Then it has community-based channels. Yes?
Let's try it
During lunchtime, you'll get an opportunity. Right now, I am on a time. But what I know is that these slides are, they are filled with content, and you can pick and keep what works within your context, okay? So there are approaches for community-based formats. There are disadvantages, and mass media, what you can use, as well as advantages of the different types. So whenever you're thinking of picking one of them, you keep in mind the advantage is this, the disadvantage is this. And of course, cost can be quite a disadvantage. The newspapers, very key. And then what they say is, if you can meet, and it's like the hierarchy of messages in small circles. If you can meet and talk, don't call. If you can call, don't send an email. Because we all know that we receive lots of emails. So if you have a message, you can actually reach someone and give it to them. It's better not to call them, give it to them. And if you can call them, don't send them an email, because at every level, a lot of variables are introduced which might reduce the chance of you getting to your audience. So we have effective communication skills, and that, the sender, the receiver, the medium, barriers, and whether you get a feedback, what are the barriers to communication. You have your telephone game, hearing versus listening. Hearing is a physical process, okay? You might be hearing me here, but you're not listening. I might be part of the background noise in your current environment. You know that, okay? So listening is a process, you actually take time to listen. I know that right now people are hearing, but the listening might not. You know when you have computers open, you can hear someone talking. You're registering some organized noise. But, okay? So hearing is different. Make sure when you're communicating, you're being heard. Okay? You're being listened to. Okay? So it goes with the essentials of communication, the do's and the don'ts.
So which one presupposes the other?
Hearing. You can hear me when you're not listening to me.
But I think both may not be important.
Why do you think both may not be important?
Because now, I think for me,
There is hearing and listening. Can you distinguish between the two?
Yes, but what I'm trying to say, in terms of passing the message, I thought there's one that you probably
listening.
No. I'm just looking at the container of conceptualizing the message. That there is listening, there is hearing, then listening. But even if you did both, for me it doesn't make sense if you don't understand the message.
I think.
So that's, I'm introducing in that other element of understanding. Because you actually can hear, you can listen, but if you probably don't understand, you have no message to take.
Yeah, actually one of the most important things about communication is that unless you have been understood,